19 female living in the BMW. A couple months ago I was looking for extra work because my hours on my regular job were shit. I'm quiet, anxious, and don't have any friends, so I turned to Craigslist. I knew the site could be sketchy, but I was desperate for side gigs and I didn't have any luck as someone with no skills and not willing to do sex work. One ad caught my attention. It offered $50 for someone to take photos of a property using either a camera or something above an iPhone 12. I have an iPhone 14, promising it would only take an hour or two. I emailed the poster and soon got a text back. The man said I seemed like a perfect fit and invited me over that same day. The house was about 20 minutes outside of town, surrounded by dense forest. It was small and run down, but nothing that raised alarms. The man who greeted me looked like he was in his 50s. He invited me inside. The house was completely empty, no furniture, just dust and dirt. I asked what to start taking photos, but he was dodging the question, making small talk and asking personal questions about me instead. My anxiety was building, so I kept the small talk going, but then he began staring at me intensely. I dropped my phone at one point when we were eventually taking photos through the house, and when he picked it up, he held onto it for a bit too long before giving it back. Unprompted when taking photos of the master bedroom, he brushed my face with his hand, complimenting my skin. I knew it was stupid coming here, but at that point my blood truly ran cold and I was done making excuses in my head. I made a quick excuse to leave, something about my mom, but when I turned towards the door, he grabbed my arm. I still have the picture I took after the ordeal with the bruises on my forearm. It felt like it was going to get snapped in half. I had brought a small knife for self-defense, a gift from my paranoid mom who would never have let me come here if she had known. Without thinking, I pulled it out and stabbed him in the arm. He let go swinging at my arm with the knife, but I was already running out of the house. I got in my car and drove until I was at the gas station, and my heart was calm. I called the police and explained everything. They took it seriously. I came in to make a report and answer questions. They searched the property in the surrounding forest but didn't find him. The house turned out to be abandoned, and in the basement they found a pack of zip ties. A report was made, but he's still out there. I call sometimes for updates, but it's never anything of substance. I've never told anyone about this other than the police, nor even my mom. I know typing this I sound pretty unbothered, but that's the first time anything like that has ever happened to me, and I have trouble leaving the house most days. I decided to type this out on here as maybe a way of getting it off my chest, as it plagues my thoughts constantly. To the man who lured me to that house, let's never meet again. This happened to me in the early 80s when I was about 14 or 15 years old. I lived on a quiet street in the suburbs of my city, in a small place you wouldn't quite call the countryside, but close, in a Spanish island of the Atlantic Ocean. It was known locally back then that little girls started disappearing more often, but it wasn't yet a topic of conversation between the towns and neighborhoods. Most of my friends lived in the city, so I would often take the bus to go meet them. That day, around 5 or 6 p.m, I decided to start walking to the bus stop since I was going to meet my friend that evening. The bus stop wasn't actually that far from my house, maybe a half a mile in distance. It was located on a quiet street with a few cars or people around and lined with old street lamps that flickered even in the daylight. I had taken this route so many times that I didn't really think anything of it. When I got there, the street was dead and had no cars or nobody to be seen around. So I just stood up for a few minutes and waited for my bus. A while later, a white van slowly approached my direction and started slowing down right next to the bus stop. I didn't think much of it, like maybe they were just parking or looking for something. But then 2 men got out and started walking towards me. One of them looked normal enough, but the other man caught my attention because his face was kind of deformed, with one hollow eye socket where his left eye should have been. His other eye locked onto mine, and the intensity of his gaze made me freeze on the spot. Before I could even process what was happening, they had a hold of me. One grabbed my arm with a grip so tight it felt like my bones were gonna snap, and the other one wrapped his arm around my waist, dragging me towards the van. Neither of them said a word, although to be honest their silence was worse than anything they could have said. I started screaming and kicking as hard as I could, but there was literally nobody around I could see. I remember even started yelling, "Fire, fire," since my mom had told me it was like a code for people who were getting abducted. It really was horrible seeing myself get pulled closer to the van, knowing I couldn't do anything to avoid it. They shoved me in the van, and as I landed on the floor, I saw a third man with a bandana covering his face, and a Doberman that was staring at me with a disgusting, creepy face that still haunts me to this day. It was in that moment that I started to think that no one would help me, or even hear me at all. I started struggling and fighting back, and I kinda managed to get them off me for a second, but they kept grabbing me and pulling me back in. I remember this distinctive metallic smell in the van, like rust or maybe blood. I felt like probably the luckiest person on earth when out of nowhere my older brother showed up. He didn't live with us at the time, so coincidentally he probably was visiting us that day. I don't really remember why he was there. He started yelling and throwing punches at the men. In the struggle they let go of me and I managed to pull myself free and back away. The men seemed to be caught off guard. After a few seconds of fighting, they ran back to their van, slammed the doors, and sped off. Right after that moment we ran home and I started crying in desperation. The walk home was hard, since my legs were shaking non-stop. I felt overwhelmed and couldn't really process what just happened to me. People who have experienced something similar know how shocked and paranoid you start to feel after this. We reported it to the police later that night, but they didn't do much. Things like this weren't taken very seriously back then. To those men, let's never, ever meet again. Back when I was 12, I went to a private school, so I needed to take a long walk to my apartment since the school was a bit far from the city center. This was in Zagreb, Croatia, so I had a lot of public transport options to get home. My usual routine was to get on a bus at the train station in front of my school, all the way down to the main street, then take a tram to a public park and walk the rest of the way home. Our school had a double timetable where one week we went to school in the morning and the other week we had classes in the afternoon. This happened during one of my afternoon weeks. I was walking out with a few classmates since we all got the same bus to the main street. The rest of my classmates were picked up by their parents. When we got in the bus there were a few empty seats, so I took a seat in front of a balding middle-aged man who was wearing slightly dirty clothes. That was my mistake. As soon as I sat down, he started staring at me with a cold look in his eyes. Feeling uncomfortable, I took a book out my bag and started reading. I would have used my phone if I could, but it was dead since I forgot to charge it before I left the house that day. The guy did not stop staring at me the whole bus ride, to the point where I couldn't even concentrate on my book, but I refused to put it down because I was scared. I would have mentioned something to my classmates, but we were all spread out on the bus and I was too scared to move. I don't know why, but I didn't want him to see that I was scared, thinking that maybe that would deter him, or I thought he was just staring at me for some stupid reason. When we finally got to our stop, my classmates and I all got off and some of us headed to the tram station while others walked away to their houses. The guy who was staring at me also got off with us and he started tailing us while keeping a fair distance. I told one of my friends about this, but urged him not to look back, thinking ignoring him would be the best option. When we got to the station, different people got on different trams since each of them had a different route. I needed to take tram number 2 and so did my friend. We waited for it to arrive and the guy was somewhere to our right, but we refused to look at him. When our tram arrived, my friend and I got on, but so did the creepy guy. When I arrived at my stop, I tried to quietly discuss with my friend if getting off with me just in case was a good idea. But then we saw the guy get off himself first and started heading into the park, opposite of where I needed to go. He probably overheard us talking since there were barely any people in the tram at that time. It was around 9 PM. But I didn't think of that, so I thought it had all been a misunderstanding. When I got off and the tram had sped away to the next station, I started walking home. It was a short distance and would have taken about 5 minutes, but then I noticed someone following me. I immediately knew it was the same guy again, so I picked up my pace and walked to my apartment. As I turned a corner into the alley that housed my apartment, the guy was getting closer. I got to the building and buzzed my mom on the intercom. I wish she would hurry up, but in the end the guy managed to catch up with me. I could smell the stench coming off him as he started talking.
Hey, how you been, buddy? I saw your dad yesterday and he told me all about how you were getting on in that school of yours,
he said. And then I immediately knew that he was lying, since my dad had been away on work-related business for months and hadn't returned home in that time once. I didn't know what to do, so I just stood there, quietly staring at him. Just then, the door buzzed and unlocked, so I bolted for it. I managed to rush in and started running up the stairs, but he was following behind me, running himself. Never in my life have I felt such an adrenaline rush as I ran up the stairs to the 3rd floor, and I had a backpack with books weighing me down, so I had a disadvantage. But in the end I managed to arrive at our door where my mum was happily waiting for me. With no warning, I shoved her away from the door as I entered before slamming it shut. Fortunately, the guy had enough common sense not to continue chasing after me. I told my mum what happened and she called the police, and they arrived sometime later, questioning me on how the guy looked and what exactly happened. In the end, they looked at the camera footage, but since it was so dark out and I didn't turn on the indoor building lights as I entered, they weren't able to get a clear view of his face. For 2 weeks I was too scared to go home alone, so my mum picked me up every time until 2 weeks later, when on the news it was said how a man was arrested for attempted kidnapping and raping of children, and the face that they showed was the exact one I saw that night. So I finally breathed a sigh of relief, knowing I was safer now, but that didn't excuse the fact that I was careless with not charging my phone, and there were still many bad people out there. Everyone, please stay safe out there. To the person who I met, if you ever get released for some ungodly reason, I hope I never see your face again. I've never told this story fully, but I remember it clearly. There were some woods next to one of my friend's house that we used to walk through all the time when we were teenagers. Back in the woods a bit, there were remains of some old structure, like a small house or something. There were concrete walls about chest high, no ceiling or roof left, and a lot of it was overgrown. We had a group of 4 friends back in the woods during the day, and we decided to try clear out the structure a little bit. We had a hatchet, machete, some pocket knives, etc. We thought we were some real Boy Scouts out there, I guess, and we cleared out some of the overgrowth. Adjacent to the structure there was also a circular hole in the ground filled with some bricks. Maybe it used to be a silo, I don't know. But we dug a small hole inside the walls, put some bricks up around it, and even used some mud to hold it together. We gathered some sticks and branches, and by the time it turned dusk we had a fire going. We were hanging out for a while until I had to go number 2, which would mean walking back to my friend's house. It was maybe a 10-minute walk or less that I'd made a ton of times, so even I wasn't too worried. I brought a flashlight and walked into the woods. I started to hear what sounded like a second set of footsteps and I stopped. It didn't sound like an animal, and it seemed to stop when I did. I got spooked and walked back towards the firelight where my friends were. I didn't want to say anything, but they saw me and asked, "What are you doing coming back so soon?" I was inside the walls again and told them, "I think there's someone else in the woods." They thought I was messing with them and I said, "No, really." And then we heard a noise from close by. It was too dark to see, but it sounded like it came from right outside the walls. To describe the sound, it was sort of like someone dropping an empty water bottle into the concrete. We got up startled and dumped a lot of water on the fire and got out the structure. The walls were crumpled enough to slip through the side, and we took the shorter, more difficult route through some thick bushes to get to the road quicker. We got out the woods as quick as we could and got to the road, and looking back, someone did come out the woods behind us. All we really saw was a man in a hoodie who followed us out the woods and stopped by the road. So that guy, let's not meet.